So, hi everyone, welcome to the second session of the second unit. And today we'll talk about Kant's ethics. So, his deontological ethics. Kant's moral theory aims to capture the common sense notion of duty. Duty, according to Kant, is not contingent on human nature, but is instead grounded in concepts of pure reason. So he has this very strong focus on this idea of duty. And so firstly, let's talk about the scope of moral obligation. So who should those ideas of moral obligation be applied to? So Kant argues that moral obligations extend to all rational beings, not limited to humans. Even if, at present, we only know of human rational agents. So the only kind of creature we know that is rational is human. But the moral requirements would apply to any rational beings, even if they are non-human. As long as they are rational, moral obligation should apply to them. So, for instance, if one day we discover that aliens are rational but they are not humans, and moral obligation should apply to them, or if one day we discover that some animals actually are rational, in Kant's sense, then we would kind of require these animals to have moral obligations. So being human is not necessarily like this criteria for moral obligation, but rationality. So what is this kind of moral obligation based on? So Kant rejects the idea that the basis of moral obligation lies in the nature of human beings. So he thinks that moral obligation is not grounded in human nature. Instead, he argues that the basis of moral obligation, the grounding of moral obligation, should be pure reason, specifically practical reason. So unlike utilitarianism ties moral obligation to what humans desire. So recall utilitarianism thinks about like the pleasure and pain of humans. So it grounds the moral obligation in terms of what humans are like and what humans want and not want. So groundings of utilitarian moral obligations include the human capacities of feeling pain and pleasure, the human nature of wanting to feel pleasure and less pain, stuff like that. So those things kind of characterize or shape what kind of moral obligation we have. So that's utilitarianism. So they are not like natural law theory, which so we didn't have space to talk about natural law theory in this class. So natural law theory ties moral obligation to natural human tendencies. So natural law theory is a theory that thinks moral obligation are defined by the kind of natural kind of tendencies or kind of intrinsic tendencies to do certain things and feel certain things. So both utilitarianism and natural law theory tie moral obligation to what humans are like. So they think morality and moral obligations and moral theories should be grounded in what humans are like. Kant rejects this. Kant argues that the foundation of moral obligation should not be found in specific human characteristics, but in rational principles. So that means what defines moral obligation is not about human, it's about rationality, it's about those rational principles he sees or envisions. Okay, so now we understand that Kant cares a lot about rationality. He thinks morality applies to all rational agents, and he thinks that there are some kind of universal rational rules or laws. So that leads us to Kant's moral requirements. So according to Kant, moral requirements represent demands on rational agents that are unconditional. So those demands should be unconditional. So how should we understand those demands on rational agents? So there are two kinds of imperatives we have to understand. So the first is hypothetical imperatives. So firstly, imagine if you want to get a philosophy degree and you come to ask me what class you should take. I will tell you that you are required to complete at least one logic class to get your degree. So the rational thing for you to do would be to take at least one logic class because you want to graduate. It is irrational if you want a philosophy degree, you want that, you won't give up the goal, but you still refuse to fulfill all its requirements, so you refuse to do a logic class. In that case, you would be irrational. So if you want to be a rational agent, if you want to be considered as rational, doing that logic class and fulfilling all the requirements to get a philosophy degree would be a demand for you to be rational, given the condition that you want a philosophy degree. So a year later, you might come to me and say, you don't want a philosophy degree anymore. Then in that case, that demand is just kind of lifted for you. Then I will tell you a logic class is no longer required for you. If you have given up that goal and that condition disappears, you won't be irrational now, even if you don't take a logic class, and even if you don't fulfill all the requirements for the class. Well, you can of course take one if you want, but that no longer is a demand on you to be rational. Why? Because now the condition you want a philosophy degree no longer exists. So this is a hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperatives are principles that express what actions are rational given a particular end or goal. So they are conditional and they're dependent on one's goals. So basically they are decided by what you want to do in your life, the kind of aims, purposes, needs and wants and goals you have. So it's pretty dependent on you and what you want. So hypothetical imperatives guide individuals on what actions to take based on their goals. So hypothetical imperatives are conditionally valid. They apply only if one has a specific goal. If someone lacks the goal mentioned in the principle, it doesn't impose rational constraints on their behavior. And to recognize these principles involves considering an ideally rational agent. So you would try to imagine this kind of perfect, ideal, rational person who reasons and acts perfectly rationally. So there is nothing they do that is irrational, and there is no thinking they have that's irrational. So the principles that would govern the behavior of such an ideal agent are reflected in hypothetical imperatives. So basically, Kant envisions this perfectly ideal rational agent, and whatever principles they have, that's the hypothetical imperatives we have. However, humans are imperfect, right? So there are human imperfections. So Kant acknowledges that humans are not always fully rational, even when we know that reason requires, even if we know that if it's irrational that I don't take a logic class, sometimes we may fail to act rationally due to the influence of desires. Maybe I desire so much to stay at home and play computer games. Even if I still have that goal of completing my philosophy degree, I won't be able to act rationally and take that logic class and attend it and pass it. So principles derived from ideal rationality are kind of presented as prescriptions for how we ought to behave to be rational in our choices and actions. And so we don't always act according to these rational rules generated by thinking about those ideal, perfect rational agents. Then Kant tries to formulate this into a formal principle, and it will always look like this. So that is the formal principle HI here. I'll not read it. This formal principle kind of captures the structure of hypothetical imperatives. So it tells us that for any demand to apply to a rational agent, there is always an end if one gives up that end, then the mind will no longer apply. So always think about, okay, what ends are we talking about here? Kant argues that morality cannot be reduced to a system of hypothetical imperatives. So if you have a list of hypothetical imperatives, Kant doesn't think you already have a moral philosophy there. So the demands hypothetical imperatives impose on us are more prudential instead of moral. So Kant thinks that the idea of duty, which he cares a lot about and is a central part of his moral philosophy, in its true moral sense, involves actions that one must do or omit regardless of the ends one may adopt based on personal desires. So Kant didn't want hypothetical imperatives to be his moral philosophy because he feels like morality and what's moral or not should not depend on the person, should not depend on what you want or not, should not depend on your desires, but it should be something more universal. So Kant was looking for something that's more universal and unchanging and kind of capable of being replied to every single rational agent, no matter who they are, what they want, and so on and so forth. So he wants something to be more kind of fundamental and universal like that. So, for instance, think about this scenario. So if someone rejects the goal of earning a philosophy degree, the claim that they should take a logical class doesn't apply. So we don't seem to get hurt there, right? But maybe we should care for a sick relative or save a drowning child or not to kill or not to steal, regardless of what personal goals or ends we have in life. Imagine if with a goal or in a circumstances your life changed, now you shouldn't care about a sick family member or friend. That sounds wrong, right? So, or if I tell you if something in your life changed, now you should no longer care about that drowning child, that seems so weird and wrong. So here emerges the concept of the unconditional validity of moral duty. Whether an action aligns with one's personal goals or desires should not determine its moral permissibility. The obligation of moral duty should stand independently of individual desires. So that's the direction Kant was going. So Kant thinks the supreme, ultimate principle of morality would be the categorical imperative. So firstly, we'll explain the conditional versus unconditional worth. So to understand and make sense of this categorical imperative. So Kant distinguishes between two kinds of ends, those achieved through action and an end in itself. So ends adopted based on desire have conditional worth. So like becoming a pianist, becoming the best champion of athlete, or get a degree, or find a loved one, all that are based on desires. So those ends or goals have conditional worth. Individuals make plans that involve the aim of accomplishing some goal or obtaining some object. But those ends that we adopt based on our desires only acquire worth or value for us because we choose them as our goals. So if I don't care about music at all, the goal of becoming the best pianist in the world just doesn't matter to me. In contrast, an end in itself possesses unconditional intrinsic worth. According to Kant, rational nature is an end in itself, so possessing dignity and unconditional value. Hypothetical imperatives capture the idea of conditional ends that gain value because we choose them as goals to establish foundation for unconditional valid moral requirements, to capture and express the idea of unconditional valid moral requirements. Kant introduces the concept of categorical imperative, so that's why we are here. So we are kind of establishing this new, more kind of ultimate, universal kind of idea related to moral philosophy. So what is the categorical imperative? So in one sentence, it is the supreme moral rule or principle from which all moral duties can be derived. The categorical imperative is a principle that tells us the moral demands on rational agents. Unlike the hypothetical imperatives, categorical imperative is unconditional. It doesn't change. It doesn't require the satisfaction of any conditions to apply to you. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what do you do, what do you want, or what do you think, as long as you are a rational agent or as long as you are a human. So this gives a much stronger demands than hypothetical imperatives. So if you want to be moral, you necessarily have to comply with the categorical imperative, no matter what you think, no matter what your circumstances are, and no matter what changes take place. So they're very, very strong and ultimate. Basically, if you want to be moral, you have to follow it. No other possibilities, no room for bargaining. So what does this categorical imperative include? So it has different formulations. We'll talk about those formulations. There are several formulations of the categorical imperative. So we'll talk about them one by one. The kind of basic idea is autonomy. So what is autonomy? So the autonomy is the capacity to act freely based on reason, independently of desire. So autonomy is the ground of human dignity. So the kind of human dignity we have, it kind of has its basis in autonomy. And the fundamental idea is that we need to respect the autonomy of agents and human dignity, like whatsoever. So that's like a universal law we have to follow right now. So we've only roughly sketched the categorical imperative. We will talk about each formulation, but before that, we'll first talk about the kind of reasoning behind the categorical imperative. So we have a kind of 7-step kind of proof or reasoning that's kind of grounding or supporting or arguing for the idea of the idea that this should be a basic, unconditional, universal requirement to respect the autonomy of agents. So here is the proof. I'll not go through it one by one, but this is just to show you that this is the kind of proof or evidence Kant offered for this doctrine he does, and this categorical imperative, and why it should make sense to us. Then now let's talk about the first formulation, that is formulation of humanity. So it goes like this. So act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. So it says that one should always act in a way that respects the autonomy, that is humanity of oneself and others, never merely as a means, but always as an end. So the famous quote we all know from Kant, that treat people as ends, never means. So that came from here. And just to explain briefly, when Kant says, so act that you use humanity. So humanity just is autonomy. So that was like a name he gave for autonomy. And what does the formulation of humanity include? So it includes both negative and positive requirements. So the negative part forbids us from treating people merely as means. So it's kind of like a restriction on us. And the positive part requires the promotion of certain ends, like self-perfection and the happiness of others. So let's talk about the negative requirements first. So I think this just captures the famous quote by Kant, the spirit of that. One thing to highlight here is that it's not just about actions or improper, arrogant attitudes towards others. and attitudes of seeing others merely as means are also considered as wrong. So it's not just like, not only if you do actions like that, it's wrong. Even if you have an attitude towards others like that, or even if in your mind you think someone is your means instead of like an end in themselves, that is wrong as well, according to Kant. Another thing I want to highlight here is that Kant's theory sometimes requires lots of further interpretative work. So you can't just take his work as it goes and it's just all clear and straightforward and we have no problems. It's never like that. Frequently, scholars have to do a lot of interpretations when you read the Kant original text. So some of you might have read it in the recommended reading. You will feel like, okay, a lot of it, I have to think about it. I have to try to interpret it and try to figure out a way to read it coherently. And philosophers frequently disagree a lot on what's the correct interpretation there. So scholars, Kantian scholars fight with each other all the time. They're still fighting till today. So I think here Timmons acknowledged that there is further interpretative work required to clarify what Kant means exactly by treating someone merely as means, and what Kant considers as wrong or unethical behaviors. So some of you might come to me and ask, okay, what did Kant mean specifically about treating people as ends instead of means? What does that actually mean? How should that be reflected in our daily actions? The answer here probably is not sure. Like, we can't be 100% sure of that. Of course, there might be different interpretations out there that you might favor, but we have not like completely settled this question. So what Timmons did was to show you some examples of the possible distinctions we can make to clarify what Kant means exactly by treating people as mere means. So Timmons also discussed saying that treating others in ways to which they could not rationally consent in pursuit of one's ends is central in understanding treating others merely as means. So if you didn't give other people to rationally consent to, then maybe you are treating them as means. But this reading also requires further work and clarification. It may have problems too. Each interpretations out there, they have their own limitations. They might have some problems or confusions as well. So I guess what Timmons did there was not to give you one single answer, but rather to kind of sketch the picture of the kind of discussions that are going on and to kind of present you with the different options that you might go with this code. So do you agree with this reading? What do you think Kant means here? So each one of you will have your own opinions and thoughts about this. So if you have thoughts of how we should interpret Kant here, or if you have any examples or experience that might help our journey of interpretation, so I hope you could share them in the discussion. And then let's talk about the positive requirements of Kant's systems of duty as well. Kant claims that all duties can be derived from the fundamental moral principle, the categorical imperative. So as long as you have it, you can figure out any fundamental moral principles from this categorical imperative, and you can organize those moral principles into a system. So according to Kant, two overarching duties of positive requirements emerge from the categorical imperative. So those are the duty of self-perfection and the duty to promote the happiness of others. And both duties are grounded in our autonomy and human dignity. So firstly, self-perfection as a duty. So Kant argues that according to the categorical imperative, individuals have a duty to perfect themselves. This duty is grounded in the capacity for autonomy, so the ability to set ends for oneself. Self-perfection involves developing certain powers to protect and promote one's autonomy. So it's also about developing the capacity required to maximize one's autonomy. And then promotion of others' happiness as a duty. So since autonomy involves pursuing various projects in life for one's own happiness, so consistency dictates recognizing the legitimacy of others' happiness. Therefore, the categorical imperative implies a duty to promote the happiness of others, specifically their morally legitimate goals. So you should promote your own autonomy, and you should also promote the autonomy of others when they have morally legitimate goals or like ethical goals. So if their goal was to kill someone, then you shouldn't promote that, right? So notice that we don't have a duty to promote our own happiness. So we have a duty to make ourselves perfect, but we don't have a duty to promote our own happiness. And also we don't have a duty to perfect others. We only have the duty to promote the happiness of others. And we'll firstly talk about the duties to oneself regarding self-perfection. So this include both duties of omission, so that is refraining from certain actions, and duties of commission, so that is adopting certain ends. These duties aim at maintaining and promoting one's autonomy. And Kant also makes this distinction between narrow and perfect duties. So narrow and perfect duties are those duties of omission requiring perfect compliance. And then also wide and imperfect duties, which are positive duties of commission, allowing leeway in deciding and when to act. So I'll explain this a bit more in the next section. Also, a very important concept is moral virtue and conscience. So perfecting one's moral nature involves making the thought of duty the sole motive in dutiful action. So this requires developing one's conscience, the kind of inborn capacity to hold oneself morally accountable. Then we'll also talk about duties to others regarding their happiness. So this also involves negative and positive duties. So duties to others regarding promoting their happiness involve negative duties, which is avoiding actions that fail to respect humanity, and also involves positive duties, which is developing attitudes of beneficence, gratitude, sympathy, and respect for others. So when we think about Kant's system of duties, one thing to keep in mind is all those duties are derived from categorical imperatives. So two sets of duties. One set is the duty of self-perfection. The other set is the the duty of promoting other people's happiness. And then within each set, there are two types of duties there. Next formulation we are going to talk about is the humanity formulation. So through this, Kant gives his theory of right conduct. I will not read the slides, so you can pause and look at the slides content. I guess I do want to explain here Kant's another distinction between perfect and imperfect duty. So actions that wrongly interfere or in some way count as actively disrespecting someone's humanity would violate the narrow or perfect duty. So for instance, I am disrespecting someone kind of intentionally and actively doing that. So I am actively harming this ideal. So in that case, that would violate the kind of narrow or perfect duty we are required to do. However, there is a different case in which you might not be actively harming or disrespecting, but you might fail to adopt certain ends, or you might have adopted them but consistently failing to act on them. So you fail to positively promote or respect humanity. So you might not be actively harming or disrespecting, but you might be just indifferent, or I just don't care, so I'm not doing anything. So things like this still fails according to Kant because it doesn't positively promote or respect humanity. So however, this doesn't violate. So if you're just indifferent, you don't care, and you are not doing anything, you are not promoting anything, that doesn't violate the narrow or perfect duty, but this does violate the imperfect duty. So here I am not actively disrespecting or violating anything. I might just be doing nothing, not promoting or helping at all, and not pursuing any ends I'm supposed to pursue. And that still is considered as a failure, and a violation of imperfect duty. So example for perfect duty would go like this. So imagine a scenario where someone needs assistance and you can help, but choose not to. So if your inaction interferes or disrespects the person's humanity, violating a narrow or perfect duty, that is morally wrong. And a imperfect duty example might be, so consider a situation where you consistently fail to support charitable causes despite having the means to do so, right? So in this case, your inaction violates an imperfect duty of positively promoting or respecting humanity. And now you may realize, okay, the imperfect duty is very hard to fulfill because there might be a lot of things we overlook or ignore or are just unaware of. And as you can see now, the formulation of humanity is the fundamental criterion of determining the rightness and wrongness of an action. So after we have this formulation of humanity in our inventory or in our theory, now we are able to determine which actions are right or wrong. We now can make conclusions like that. And how we can do that? Just by looking at whether someone has violated the narrow perfect duty and also the imperfect duty. So if an action doesn't violate both kinds of duties, that's good. If an action violates one or both of the duties, that's a wrong action. That's an ethical action. So we are now moving on to the next two formulations of the categorical imperative. However, to do that, we have to firstly explain what a maxim is. So maxim is a very central idea in Kant's philosophy. So Kant defines a maxim as a subjective principle of volition, representing an agent's intention when acting intentionally. So he always has this form: I will do whatsoever, if when do whatsoever, in order to do whatsoever. So you can fill in the blank space. So the blank is filled by a description of the action. The second blank is filled with a description of the circumstances in which the agent is contemplating doing or has done the action. And the last blank should be filled with a description of the agent's purpose or end to be achieved by the action. So the next formulation we're going to talk about is the formula of universal law, so FUL. So firstly, it goes like this: act only according to that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. And we also have a reformulation of FUL, that is FLN, so formula of law of nature, which goes like this: so act as if the maxim of your action were to become, by a will, a universal law of nature. So FLN is used to test the morality of actions, determining whether one's maxim is universalizable. So both of them serve as a decision procedure or test for moral deliberation. It guides individuals in determining the moral permissibility of their actions. For our purpose here, you don't need to worry about the difference between them two and why Kant did the reformulation and why did he kind of formulate them in this way. So a lot of people think those two are actually equivalent. So while Kant claims the equivalence of FH and FLN, Timmons proposes an interpretation that reads FH as a moral criterion and FLN as a practical decision procedure. And Kant argues that at this point, the kind of theoretical work and kind of basis he's done just now leads us to have kind of three concepts or three conclusions we can make about an action. So we can argue whether an action is obligatory or wrong or optional. So those would be the criteria or definition of those three concepts. So now you can utilize these concepts and kind of make comments about different actions and evaluations as well. And then one might say, wait, Kant, you were moving way too fast there, right? How did you get to the conclusions of obligatory or wrong or optional? How did you form these definitions? Okay, we want to believe you, but you need to give us more evidence for that. So that all of that was determined by the kind of test, the narrow or perfect duty test Kant had in mind. So the general idea is you should ask whether you can will this maxim, so whether you can kind of universalize this maxim as a universal law of nature. So if you believe in a certain maxim, and if a world where everyone believe this maxim is not inconceivable or contradictory, that means whatever the maxim you're having there is okay. So for instance, imagine you have this maxim: I will get money by lying whenever I need money, and I have no other way of getting it. So if you believe in this maxim, then and now to do the test, you have to universalize it. So the universal version of this would be everyone will get money by lying whenever in need of money and having no other way of getting it. So this leads to contradiction, because if everyone has this as their maxim, no one will be able to lie, because we all know that each other is lying. For lying to be successful, the recipient of the lie, or whoever is hearing the lie, has to actually believe the lie. But in the world where this maxim is universal, we all know that each other are just lying to get money. No one will ever believe anyone else. Acting in compliance with this maxim and universalizing it isn't possible in a world where we universalize this maxim. So now we know universalizing this maxim leads to a contradictory world. Maxims that lead to contradictions or this kind of problematic scenarios where kind of inconceivability, when it's universalized, are morally wrong. So the action mentioned in the maxim will be forbidden, a violation of our narrow or perfect duty. So the test basically goes like this: if you have a maxim, universalize it and see if you can imagine a world, or if you will still be able to act according to that maxim when it's universalized. And if it leads to contradiction, or you can't imagine a world like that, or you won't be able to adopt your maxim if it's universalized, then that is a wrong action. That will not be a morally permissible action. So this is the test one we have to go through for maxims. That is the narrow or perfect duty test. And then we would talk about the test 2, the wide or imperfect duty test. Some maxims corresponding to actions that violate one's duties can be conceived as a universal law of nature without contradiction, but they still cannot be consistently willed as a universal law of nature because they fail the wide or imperfect duty test. So for those maxims that pass the first test, they still have to pass the second test. So recall what we discussed a few minutes ago. We have a wide or imperfect duty to actively promote humanity and pursue certain ends. Imagine if I have this maxim: I will refrain from helping those in need whenever I can help, even though I am well off. And the universalized version of this maxim is implication: everyone will refrain from helping others and from helping those in need whenever they can help, even though they are well off. But Kant argues, as a rational agent, we necessarily want to be helped whenever one is in need. So this argument is grounded in the fact that we have wide or imperfect duty, which in turn is grounded in our autonomy and dignity. So it can be formulated like this. So what is rational is, I will to be helped whenever I am in need and others who are well off and can help me. So for anyone who is rational, they would think this, right? They would want to be helped when they're in need, right? And rational and implication contradict with each other. We would have an inconsistency here. So in the selfishness case, universalizing the maxim doesn't itself lead to contradiction. Thus, it's not forbidden right away in the test 1. And it's not a violation of our narrow or perfect duty. So recall what we've explained. Narrow or perfect duty concerns with what's forbidden and what we necessarily should not do. But if we universalize the selfish maxim, we won't actively promote humanity to pursue the ends we are supposed to pursue. So, universalizing the selfish maxim violates our wide or imperfect duty. And I think a different way to understand this would be, if you maximize a maxim like that, if you universalize it, if you universalize this maxim of selfishness, and if you're a rational person, universalizing this selfishness maxim would create the world a rational agent wouldn't want to live in. No rational agent would want to live in a world where they would be in need and no one would help them, right? So this kind of selfishness maxim is rejected on the ground that we are rational agents. And there are, of course, possible objections to Kant's tests, right? So critics argue that those texts sometimes provide incorrect moral judgments, leading to false negatives. So sometimes we could, according to Kant's procedure, and even if we follow his procedure, we might wrongly deem morally permissible actions to be wrong, and we might have false positives. So sometimes we might wrongly deem morally wrong actions to be permissible. But there are also potential ways to save this theory and to reply to those counterexamples. So for instance, by working around maxims and making our concepts of maxims more like clear and fine-grained, there are a lot of developments we can do to save those kind of counterexample cases. So I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information in one lecture, so I'll not talk about those objections and replies in a lot of details here, but you can find all that in Timmon's paper. So at this stage, we can pretty much form or all the theoretical work we've just done are enough to build up a theory of value. So let's talk about what is Kant's theory of value. So firstly, autonomy in Kant's moral philosophy would be an intrinsic and conditional value, and the kind of dignity is given a central place and emphasis in Kant's moral philosophy. One's capacity for autonomous choice makes a human being worthy of respect and gives them dignity. So dignity is grounded in autonomy, and autonomy itself is intrinsic and conditional. Autonomy and dignity have unconditional and incomparable worth in Kant's terms. This leads to the idea that all persons, as ends in themselves, deserve respect, even if their actions may make them unworthy of it. So no matter who they are, no matter what they've done, no matter if they've killed someone or what kind of circumstances they live in, they deserve respect because they are persons. And even if they have done things that seem to make them being unworthy of respect, they still deserve respect. And also the concept of moral worth. So Kant distinguishes between actions fulfilling obligations and those done from the motive duty. So Kant thinks if you are just merely kind of complying with duty, driven by self-interest, that lacks moral worth. So he thinks moral worth comes from when actions are motivated only because I recognize I have such a duty. So I am giving people like the right amount of change when I'm being the accountant in a shop because I want people to come back to my shop. So that would be compliance with duty driven by self-interest. But if I give people the correct amount of change, if I'm an accountant, because I know this is my duty, it's the right thing to do, it would be the action that has moral worth. So even if you're doing the same thing, if you're doing it just for self-interest, that's not of moral worth, according to Kant. You have to do it because you think that's a duty. So being a morally virtuous person involves two elements. So firstly, it requires a good will, disposition to act solely from the motive of duty. Second, it involves the ability to act consistently from a good will, requiring inner strength to resist temptation and adhere to duty. Virtue, therefore, according to Kant, is a combination of goodwill and the strength to consistently act from it. So now we have this concept of virtue. In Kant's work, he proposes a concept of the highest good. So the highest complete good for human beings, according to Kant, involves both virtue and happiness. So Kant thinks that we cannot achieve truly virtuous character and moral perfection and the highest good are attainable. He needed additional postulates to enable his beliefs. So he had two additional postulates. The first is the immortality of the soul, as achieving complete moral perfection and holiness is a continuous process. If our souls are immortal, then we can always keep going in this process of achieving moral perfection. Since being virtuous does not necessarily lead to happiness, Kant thinks only if we assume the existence of God, we can get the possibility of happiness befitting virtue. The highest good, virtue rewarded with happiness, is only conceivable with the assumptions of immortality of the soul and God. So that is a kind of more metaphysical part of Kant's work. We don't have to worry too much about that, but just want to let you know that Kant's moral philosophy actually had some of that setting there as well. So he talked about God, immortality of souls, and then like human cognitive faculties and kind of transcendental and stuff. So those things are also like there in the background when Kant talk about all these theoretical work we talk about today. Oh, we've gone on and on about what Kant's moral philosophy involves, right? So is it a good moral theory? How should we evaluate it? Does it have certain problems or weaknesses, or can we raise some disagreements with it? So let's talk about this. So firstly, Timmins points out that Kant has a fundamental disagreement with Hume's instrumentalist view of practical reason. So Hume contends that reason serves desires and categorical imperatives, so requirements that are not based on desire cannot be valid. So recall when we talk about categorical imperatives, we said Kant thinks he wants some kind of universal moral rule that is not dependent on individual circumstances or individual's desires or goals, but is universal and can be applied to every single individual, whatever they think or desire or feel like. Hume thinks reason serves desires. So Hume thinks something like that, the kind of universal thing that's independent from desire, should not be valid. So if you are like a Humean philosopher, you might find Kant's philosophy pretty problematic, right? And then we might also dive in deeper and ask, okay, why did Kant think we need a universal moral rule like that? Why does Kant think the categorical imperative has to be independent from individual circumstances and desires and goals? Is that a valid assumption? Why should we go after an assumption like that? This is not to say that we should definitely follow Hume, but to kind of jump out and look at both of them from a different perspective and question, like, why did you have those assumptions, like, to both of them, and to kind of figure out, like, your own opinion. And also, in terms of, so some people argue that Kant might be in disagreement with Aristotle. Maybe a truly virtuous person doesn't face such internal conflicts. And so Aristotle would argue something like that. However, according to Kant, Kant thinks all people, no matter who they are, experience conflicts in overcoming temptation. So there is a tension between Aristotle and Kant as well. So that is about what Kant thinks is moral virtue. So Kant's account of moral virtue involves a person possessing moral strength to overcome temptation and acting solely from the motive duty when duty calls. But there is always this process of going like through and overcoming temptation. But according to Aristotle, like that kind of tension is not there from the first place. People have also made objections towards the categorical imperative. So the first critique is called the absolutism critique. So critics argue that the categorical imperative, being abstract, may lead to moral absolutism, and this overlooks morally relevant details of concrete situations and exceptional cases. Right, when we think about moral cases, there are a lot of exceptions, right? We say this sentence a lot. Okay, this is a complex case, and probably it really depends on like a lot of details, right? Kant's categorical imperative kind of makes this assumption that all that doesn't matter, all that details, all that exceptions don't matter. Is that good? Or maybe that's too strong, right? People have argued that. The second is the indeterminacy critique. So the concept of respecting humanity is very central to Kant's moral theory. But this has been criticized for its vagueness. People argue that this concept of humanity and respecting humanity is just not clear. So what are you talking about there? Like, what are you actually saying there? And people might misinterpret it a lot, right? So critics argue that it might lead to indeterminacy in moral judgments, making it difficult to decide whether certain actions respect humanity. Okay, so they feel like when it comes to real life cases, what might happen would be like this. Okay, I say that action is not respecting humanity. Then you might ask me, okay, what do you mean by respecting humanity? Like, this concept of respecting humanity itself doesn't come with clear criteria and clear boundaries and conditions. So there would be a lot of cases that seem to be kind of on the borderline for whether it counts as respecting humanity, right? And we don't have like very concrete procedures to lead us through these. So a lot of the cases we might be in a gray area, so it's not always black and white. We might be in this gray area of wondering, okay, is this action respecting humanity or not? And both sides seem to work, right? Things like that happen a lot. So you might also have potential replies to those objections as well. So it's not like Kant's theory is already hopeless. There are a lot of ways we can save it as well. So I'll talk about some of these very quickly as well. So the first is that we can consider specific duties. So Timmins argues that understanding Kant's moral theory involves considering a plurality of specific duties rather than relying solely on a general moral principle. So maybe this concept of plurality of specific duties help. So we are not just working with a universal, super general, vague moral principle. We are working with kind of concrete, specific duties. And also in terms of handling conflicting duties. So Kant's distinction between narrow or perfect and wide or imperfect duties is proposed as a way to handle conflict situations. So philosophers have argued that if you want to resolve like conflicts of duties, that distinction might help you a lot. We might also kind of develop Kant's moral theory to a limited pluralistic moral theory. So it suggests that given the challenges and objections, Kant's theory should be seen as limited in its ability to resolve conflicts, making it a form of moral pluralism. So what you can do is also can also be like this. So you might think, okay, Kant's theory makes sense, and it makes a lot of sense, and you like it, but it's limited. We also recognize that. So what we might do is to preserve Kant's theory, but also let other moral theories come in. So we would hold a form of moral pluralism, which means that you would hold different kind of moral views altogether. Like you might combine different moral views together. You preserve Kant in there, but you also allow some other moral theories that are better at resolving those conflicts, and we introduce those in. So that might be a way to save and go forward with Kant's theory as well. So that has been the evaluation. So thank you so much. We'll apply those moral theories more like in later cases and classes. But thank you so much, and I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and see you in the next lecture.